Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel podcast here, and we have, once again, myself, Chris, and we have Wyatt Claypool from the National Telegraph. Today we're going to talk about a couple things: consultants, capital gains tax inclusion changes, and other things that are going to pop up. So, with no further start, let us begin with the capital gains stuff.
And
So,
and really, everything we're talking about here has to do with consultants, because as we get into this topic, there is no doubt in my mind that the capital gains inclusion rate increase was an idea hatched by consultants, focus groups, and political lobbyists in the back of the Liberal Party, thinking that this was a fantastic idea.
yep. So what we have here, this is the most. Now, this is not the first poll, and this is not the last poll that's going to poll test this. And other ones have had very similar numbers. If you can just trust me on that one, I don't want to pull them up here because it's too many polls to pull up. But here we go. We have this: do you support or oppose the capital gains tax? And every single age group opposes it. Even the youngest people oppose it. Now, it's a narrow margin on the youngest people. It's 38 opposed to 34 support. But then by the time you get to the middle age, such as like 45 to 54 and 55 to 64, it's a very strong opposition. And this is just a terrible position to be in as an incumbent government introducing a signature policy that you're going to be hopefully running on, which is just completely divisive. It's completely opposed by most people. And like you could think to yourself, oh, 33%, that's not bad. Or sorry, 32% nationally is not bad. That's better than the Liberals are currently polling. The problem with that is it's going to include Greens, Bloc, NDPers who like the policy change still aren't going to vote for the Liberals. So just because
And
you have a larger number support your policy than support you doesn't mean they're not going to support you as well.
yeah, because obviously you don't have to be part of that party to believe that generic like policy standpoint. Not when I say generic, I just mean that it's not something where you have to have like super strong ideological ties in one direction or another to be able to come to that conclusion. There's even some conservatives who believe the inclusion rate was good. You get some more populist types who are like who, you know, have an opposition to the rich. But mostly it will be people who get more and more left wing, and the liberals would be crazy to assume that they own the further left votes in Canada. But there's nothing wrong with being controversial in Canadian politics. This was a controversial policy. In theory, this might have actually given them a shot in the arm. And I think actually for the first week or two, it did give them a shot in the arm because the Liberals were fighting over something and they looked like they had their energy back and they were, going after the Conservatives for, being stooges for the rich or whatever the narrative was. It was kind of muddled. But the problem is when you looked at the underlying polling, and we'll get into it by party in a second, this is the wrong type of wedge issue because you want to pick wedge issues where you are winning most of the undecided people, where the people who are undecided between the parties are willing to move over to you. If not, people from the other party are willing to move over to you. Like you brought up, and actually probably in one of our first episodes, the stance that Pierre Poilievre took as leader of the Conservative Party in favor of seal hunting in the Maritimes, and how
Mm-hmm.
that seems like a strange issue. But the whole point is that people who are decidedly against that practice pretty much already vote Liberal, and they're mostly in downtown Toronto, and most people in the country don't care, except for fishermen in the Maritimes who will 100% vote for any party who will actually let them like get rid of some seals so they can recover some of the fishing stocks.
Yeah, like that's a perfect example of a wedge issue because what you want in a wedge issue is first off you want to wedge something that's not already wedged. For example, when liberals rolled out like abortion as a wedge issue, that's already been wedged. Like that, we've already split that log, right? No one in 2024 is looking at the conservative party like, ah, yes, this is the party that's for abortion. No one's looking at the liberals and say, ah, yes, this is the party that's against abortion. Like that's already been wedged. But with something like the seal hunting, that hasn't been wedged yet, so it's a new issue. And the way it wedges is it naturally pushes people who are currently not voting conservative to conservative, both on the initial position, which is, oh, we're going to do this policy that's going to let you hunt more seals, but then also the backlash to it is going to push them. So you're going to positively polarize the target demographic, Newfoundland fishermen and seal hunters, And you're going to negatively polarize them because the people in downtown Toronto, those environmentalist types, are going to get really mad at you and get really visceral, angry about this policy, which is going to make these people in Newfoundland be like, wait a minute, this is how I get my livelihood, and you're just like hating me over it.
And also, there is just a lot of issues like the seal hunting one, where it actually kind of like the Freedom Convoy polling. That yeah, you can get a majority of people saying that they think the Freedom Convoy is bad and the police should move in, and like with tanks and whatnot, like some of that polling was actually proposing. But most people, when they have a negative opinion about the Freedom Convoy, it's oh yeah, I don't really quite approve of that. You get some super viscerally angry people, but mostly you're going to have the people who are passionate actually are leaning Freedom Convoy. So the people who are actually making a decision based on whether they like a politician or political brand based on their position on the convoy, that the Conservatives and the PPC had more to gain than the Liberals and the NDP did by opposing it. Like the Conservatives didn't really support it by being open about it. Thinking that these people have the right to protest and they're here because they're angry, even though maybe we don't support the way they're doing things. They gained more, even though the polling showed that technically more people were against them on that issue. And it's exact same now with this capital gains inclusion rate. You can find all the polling in the world that you want showing a lot of people are in favor of this policy. Not this particular poll, but I've seen you've probably seen other ones too,
Yeah.
where it's just a straight up do agree with it or not. A lot of people say yes, but most people just say yes because we're making it so we're increasing capital gains inclusion rates to bring more government revenue for some social programs. And people say, well, that sounds good because people don't really think deeply about a question thrown at them like that.
Well, one of the big issues with we both have this issue with issue polling, but one of the issues with issue polling is the question you ask matters a lot. Like, for example, this Angus Reid question is very neutral. Do you support or oppose this increase? And before this, it prefaces what the increase is, what it's actually doing. That's a very neutral question. But some of the questions, I think it was Ledger was asking, it's like, do you think we should raise capital gains tax to fund more social programs? And it's like, oh, okay, that's like a very loaded question. Like you're presupposing a lot in that question, because what is being taxed doesn't necessarily mean that's what the money's going to be spent on. You could end up having the capital gains tax and no new welfare being spent. Those are not necessarily related things. Or we could have new welfare without the capital gains tax. So the question you ask can change the answer a lot. And also, as we mentioned before on previous podcasts, I don't actually like how Angus Reid does it with the strongly support, oppose, strongly oppose. Because then you kind of force people to take answers when they actually don't really care. Because in reality, what I suspect this is these support and oppose columns probably don't care that much. So in the end, it's not like 34% of under 35 support it and 38% oppose. It's probably 18 oppose and 16 support, and everyone else just doesn't care or doesn't really understand.
Yeah, and what you should almost be doing with polling like that is you should rank recent issues and ask people like, can you rank 1 out of 5, 1 to 5 on these 5 issues of which one do you care about most and which one do you care about least? And capital gains inclusion rate in a lot of the stuff that's happening recently with like foreign interference or other policy issues that the Liberals are pushing forward, this would probably not rank very highly in what's motivating votes. Because at the end of the day, everyone kind of votes for 1 or 2 things, and the idea that capital gains inclusion rate is going to be a big deal for progressive voters doesn't really make sense to me because I don't feel like there's that many voters who come out in favor of tax increases. You're mostly only going to have people come out against tax increases.
Yeah.
Even if they're not rich, people just generically do not like tax increases, even if it doesn't apply to them. And then you'll get some left wing people like gaslighting them, like you're being fooled into voting for whatever the rich like. It's like, or like it's that what's that stupid communist concept where you
False consciousness?
false consciousness, yeah, like
Yeah.
that you're like standing up for the system because you're tricked into thinking you're a member of it rather than just a cog in the machine. It's like no, people understand that if you raise taxes on rich people, that wage increases are probably not going to be forthcoming.
Yeah, and if we. I'm not going to go too far into these cross tables for this question because that's a little excessive for this kind of video, but we look here and we look at just the top two boxes here. The only provinces that this theoretically plays well in is Atlantic Canada, which you might say, oh, well, maybe they're going to try to win back Atlantic Canada on this, but it's like, this is like not, I can say as someone from Nova Scotia, this is not even on the radar for people. No one actually cares about this issue. You might have 30% of people being like, oh yeah, that's fine, okay. But you actually talk to people, and what are the things to talk about? Inflation, housing, healthcare, education. Sometimes jobs.
That's why I also just reject out of hand whenever people say, or when I say whenever people say, I mean like in terms of the polling issue questions they give, like, or what issues matter most to you. Whenever people say like, oh, I care about the environment, like, no, you don't. You don't. 3% of people care about the environment most in an election, and they all vote green.
Yeah, the rule of thumb I have in all things related to politics, it's the average person test. If no one in my life has either directly or indirectly said to me that issue, no one cares about it. Either they don't know it happened, or they heard, and it just doesn't matter to them, so they never talk about it.
Also, look at the crosstabs for the Maritimes. This also backs up our point that in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the strong support is the highest. And even when you account for the Newfoundland actually having much higher just general support, it's the Maritimes where they have the very fiscally center-left but socially conservative voters that are more supportive of policies like this, which is horrible for the Liberals because those people have already completely rejected the Liberals on many social issues. And so fiscal issues are no longer motivating to these voters the way that they were back in 2015 and 2019.
And a lot of these voters, too, like let's take Newfoundland, for example. Like, crash course in Newfoundland demography for people who are not familiar with the province. Almost the entire population of Newfoundland lives in small towns. It's like 80% of the population live in small towns. And most of these people either work in fishing or they drive to, say, like a mine or like an oil field or something like that, right? Like, they commute and drive a lot. They use a lot of gas. They probably have an oil or natural gas furnace in their house because Newfoundland gets quite cold in the winter. These people are the people most affected by the carbon tax and the least benefited from it because their rebates are not going to come anywhere close to how much fuel they're using in their life. So yeah, maybe this issue plays okay in Newfoundland, but then things like the carbon tax policy completely drown out anything here.
Also, small town culture just is not very susceptible to hyper environmentalism. You kind of almost need that big city kind of environment, which is ironic, in order to get people to really care about the climate in this very abstract sense that we need to stop using fuel or everything's going to burn up. You have to be in a place where there's not a lot of trees to believe this.
Yeah. There's a fun little game, I think it's published by Alex McAfee. You can play online through your browser. It's called the Census Guess or something like that. And anyways, you just like guess towns in the country, and it will tally up the population of each province to see how much of the population you can guess in the province. And one of the hardest ones, actually, the Maritimes in general is actually relatively hard, like New Brunswick, Newfoundland, because there's so many small towns and the cities are not very, like, the big cities that you think of are like a very small percent of the population. Where they're, and this is one of the things. It's like the demographics here actually do not play very well with a lot of things like this. Like, the capital gains issue just doesn't register to people because most people in these small towns are their own homeowners who've seen their property values like triple in the last 30 years, which is ridiculous and stupid, but like that's what it is. I mean, I bought a house recently, and the last time my house was sold, the previous owner, they bought in 2018 for half the price I bought it for. 100% housing inflation in 6 years in Nova Scotia. 100%. Doubled price. Like, that's just ridiculous, right? And everyone sees this, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. What? Like, it doesn't play well. Like, they don't care.
I was going to still say, that's still a third of the price of a house in Toronto.
Well, where I bought, yes. If you go to actually Halifax itself, you're looking at probably three quarters. Like you're looking at like 600, 750, depending on exactly what neighborhood you want to buy in.
Maybe this is a good time to jump over to the party polling on the increase issue, because this is I think the really troubling thing if you're a liberal
Oops.
party MP and you're wondering what your party's consultants just got you into here.
Do you mean like this? Here?
Yeah, it's this,
Yeah.
where it's showing what amount of people from different parties support the increase happening. Obviously, you have a lot of liberals because they
Mm-hmm.
were the ones spearheading this program. But when you actually start looking at the amount that the liberals seek to gain or are risking to gain, it's so unbalanced. They risk to lose so much in favor of basically a group of voters who don't care.
I mean, yeah, I mean, for a perfect example is, right? CPC here has basically a rounding error of people who strongly care about this. So if the Liberals are trying to wedge current contemporary conservative voters, you're looking at 1%, but you could lose 9% of your own who strongly oppose this. They're probably not going to win over many of these NDP voters, though they might. It's possible, but not likely. And they're definitely not going to win these Bloc voters from, because I can guarantee you, based on all the Bloc Quebecois supporters I've talked to, this is not an issue for them. They might support it. They might be like, yeah, that's a good idea, but that's not deciding their vote.
Yeah, really, it's probably just proving that there's a lot of Quebec Solidaire voters within the Bloc's group of people willing to vote for them, since it is a pro-separatist party, I believe.
Yeah, the leadership of the Quebec Solidaire is pro-separatist, but the base is not that separatist anymore. It's like 60% opposed, I think, based on the
Oh,
polling.
fair enough. But my point is that that they're still the type of people who will
Yeah.
vote Bloc on a federal level, and that's probably the sort of people
Oh,
driving
absolutely.
the approval of the capital gains increase.
Yep.
And I think also just I think the marketing of this, also when it's your third, fourth term in government, uh, and you're rolling out this capital gains increase, nobody thinks that this is because of an actual issue of fairness. It looks like it's a pure issue of
Mm-hmm.
revenue going down in terms of taxes. And so it's hard to market this as like this big moment that you're trying to create of trying to create a finally we're going after the ultra wealthy and trying to bring true equity to our economy. That works if you're running in 2015. I think it's still silly, but that works when you're running in 2015 when that's like your lead policy alongside getting rid of like legalizing marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's your third term, you're limping along, you're way down the polls. It's one of those things that's too obvious that you're doing this
Mm-hmm.
because you're trying to pander to me. And the issue too is when you look at those who describe themselves as very well off. That I believe is the only demographic or section of voters who still votes liberal. That is the only one that the liberals still win. They get like 36%, not even a big portion, not like a big majority of people who say that they're doing really well. So like 36% of them are voting liberal. And I think even underneath that, the conservatives are still at 30. But obviously, if you're doing well, you would be more, you know, apt to voting for who is ever currently in power. But that's wild. That then this policy goes after those people who tended to like the liberals.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'll say with that too is, for initially in their outpour, the liberals are trying to say like all these economists like Trevor Tome and all these other people support this change. But then you actually look at the writings of Trevor Tome, and he's saying that yeah, it makes sense to equalize things like dividends and capital gains and income, and that they're all taxed the same way. But we need to reduce all of our taxes. Our actual tax rates are too high. How we tax income versus dividends versus capital gains, that should be, we can replay with that, and that actually makes sense according to Trevor Tome. But the tax rates are too high. What the liberals are doing here is they're playing around with half of what he's saying to do. So you can't really say, look, Trevor Tome says it's a good idea if you don't do everything that he's saying you should do. You can't just pick and choose about policies like that. If you're going to an expert and the expert is saying this, like a thing, you got to do their whole
Actually,
thing.
Trevor Toombs was my actually supervisor for my master's degree research project, and so I ended up following him, and I was like looking at a lot of his posts on X
Mm-hmm.
for what he says on different issues. And yeah, people so often misinterpret what he says on issues. Like him and the food professor will fight about the idea of food inflation. But some people will use Trevor Toombs like reactionarily to say like, no. See, the carbon tax actually doesn't affect food prices. It's like, no. He's showing that you can only prove about 1% of the food price inflation with the carbon tax, or 1% of the inflation, not like 1% of the full inflation, but like 1% of the price increase.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but like that's not saying that the carbon tax isn't like that food prices aren't going up or that the carbon tax is affecting anything, but people will just pretend that that's not what it's saying at all. But obviously nobody's claiming that the carbon tax doesn't affect prices.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if it doesn't affect prices, it just fundamentally wouldn't work. The entire idea about it is that it affects prices.
Yeah.
And the other funny thing about this whole too, and this is a peak moment. This something could only have in 2024. Is Polyev came out with a 15-minute, highly edited, quite effective and very or quite well done, I should say, video essay. You can see it on his YouTube channel. I'm not going to link it here, but you can find it if you want to look at it. Going in why the conservatives oppose this, and it's like that's like the best way to defeat a policy attack. The liberals are trying to say the conservatives don't want to raise tax on the rich, and then you get a 15-minute high production value video explaining what their entire position is.
And,
That
well, and the thing is too that I think that this is the bias from people on the left, and you have this also from people on the right on different issues. They assume that the populist position on taxes is to raise it on the rich, when there actually is a blue collar appeal to cutting taxes for everyone, because get the government out of everyone's lives. Like there are a lot of people who are lower middle class who are perfectly fine with people who have more money than them getting tax cuts, because as they don't think in pure oppositional terms to people who earn more, because they just see this as they see themselves not making as much as being an issue of the government meddling, and they can't find a job because everything's taxed to death. There's a
mm-hmm.
large group of people like that in the country. Yes, liberal, but the liberals have a lot of people who work for the government who they are directly benefited by the government collecting revenues, so they end up creating a bubble for themselves where they trick themselves into thinking that this is a thing that really fires up the average voter, when it's really just the fires up the person who was already voting for them and was not going to change.
Yeah, and I think it really shows across the board, like the demographics here that support this policy. Support is a strong word because no demographic supports this policy, but the ones who oppose it the least, you're looking at like the less than 25K incomes, the less than 50K incomes, like the young people. These are the people, in theory, historically speaking, have been locked in for various left-wing parties for various reasons, which probably out of the scope of this video to explain why that is, but there's reasons for it.
And even look at the 65 plus, and this is where a lot of liberal strength comes from, and this is why there is a bit more support than in other demographics, because you get a lot of pensioners who, again, they do see a relationship between the amount that is taxed and the amount that they get in pension benefits in the future. And so that the problem with that demographic and trying to like overwin that group, like the liberals are not winning any age bracket, but that's where they disproportionately do well with, but they're doubling down on who they disproportionately do well with, a demographic who just based on the process of time will not be voting for them in 30 years.
Yeah, actually, we can bring that up here. So this is this Angus Reid polls cross table for the 2021 or 2025 vote. Look here, 55 plus voters, 26% support the Liberal Party, and that's the strongest one. That's blows out under 35s and 35 to 54s out of the water. And Angus Reid, fortunately, publishes even more highly detailed ones, and the Liberals do the best individually with 55 to 64s, but they're the closest to the Conservatives with 65 plus. They're only 16 points behind, whereas every other demographic is higher. 17 here, 25 here, 32 there, etc. 19 there. So the pensioner demographic and the soon to be pensioner demographic is their strongest vote, and it doesn't play super well with them either. This policy, if we go back over here, they're they're a little more supportive, as Wyatt pointed out, but not by much.
Yeah, a little bit more supportive, a little bit more negative, but at the same time, even compared to younger people, the strongly supporting is also lower. Effectively, what we're looking at is this is the blandest, flash in a pan policy that the liberals could have come up with. Like all their other ones have been far better. Like they're bad policies, but like universal dental, universal pharmacare, even though it's both are effectively scams in terms of just not being efficient programs or they're not actually covering nearly what the liberals claim they cover, at least that makes every person feel like they're getting something, no matter your income level.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is with this one is it's directly going after a group of people that were actually kind of voting liberal in larger proportions than any other group, which was the people who describe themselves as well off, to win people who don't exist. Either they're already voting liberal, or they're the liberals in a certain bigoted way are thinking like, well, you're poor, ergo you hate the rich because you blame them. Like it's a very socialist mentality in the Liberal Party's comms team, and I think this also just demonstrates comms teams watch too much internet politics because they are like trying to win Hassan Piker voters here.
Yeah, I think that's really the story of 2024. Is the liberal comms team has absolutely no idea what it's doing. They don't know who to target. They don't know what their policy is. They don't know what their voters are. They don't know what their plan is. And part of that is leadership. They don't really have a good plan. And I think there's a lot of denial in Liberal HQ on why they're so far behind in the polls. But then their comms team just keeps throwing out these just F tier policies or these F tier defenses of these policies. They're just like, you think this is a good video? You think this is a good ad?
Yeah, and that's that. Oh, the best one they just released was going after the Freedom Convoy. They weren't even convoy people. They're actually from like the slow roll from the bikers, and they put out that thing trying to go after the conservatives because, wow, these people said that they got on the phone with their local conservative MPs and they talked to them. I'm like, you're literally advertising the fact that the conservatives actually will pick up the phone and talk to constituents. Why are you doing this?
And why? You see, for a while that was isolated to just like weak media commentators like Rachel Gilmore, but then it got spread out a bit, where people were attacking conservative politicians primarily because they took a photo with a random person who turned out to be quote unquote a person non grata, and it's like, okay, but why would they know who that is?
Well,
Like,
and that's always the funny thing is that a lot of stuff loses power the further away you get from the heyday where some of these like nasty figures were popular. Like Paul Fromm, you have to explain who Paul Fromm is every time he's like captured in a photo with a conservative politician, and that's Paul Fromm's game. Like, and Paul Fromm is like a legitimate neo-Nazi, but or like white supremacist. But whenever he's like grifting by taking photos of people to stir outrage, now you have to like have 3 paragraphs just describing who he is. And the same thing's going to happen with Jeremy McKenzie. Is that Jeremy McKenzie just nobody knows who he is, nobody really cares, and he's kind of a loser. But so whenever the liberals were putting out those videos of like these far right people are talking about how they can influence Pierre, one, there it takes way too much of an explanation on who these guys are. Plus, they're obviously anti-Pierre. So if anything, you're just exposing the fact that those who have nasty views do not like what Polyev is doing.
mm-hmm. It seems like a lot of their campaign thus far, and it's weird saying it's a campaign because it's not actually an election, but I guess that's technically what it is, right? It's a campaign. It has really just been failures like that. I could go back to the history of the Liberal Party ads that have been coming up, but like they're just terrible. It it's truly remarkable how bad their ads are.
There's like an actual sluggishness just to the way they do stuff. It almost feels like Andrew Scheer ads, but with Justin Trudeau, where it's just like, hey guys, what our government is releasing a really new and exciting program to get you dental care and for free. And it's like, this is so bad for a Trudeau who used to have energy. Like there's a clip of him in question period where he was trying to attack Polyev, and he actually just sounded tired the entire time. He just sounded monotone and tired. He was just like, "Well, I'll remind the opposition leader that when he was being endorsed by Alex Jones, I was." It was like, what's going on, man? Did like something happen in the background of the party, and you've been told that you're not gonna be the leader in 2 months or something? This is just comatose.
Oh yes. Okay, so I'm gonna start bringing up some of these great ads here. Okay, so this first one. This is one of the worst ads I've ever seen in my life.
Oh, I love this one so much. It's so bad.
Wacko. 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 This wacko. A total wacko. One wacko. Wacko. These socialist wackos. He's a wacko. 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 They've got.
I feel like I don't really need to explain why this is bad, but the idea that the liberals are trying to plant here is that Poilievre and Trump have said the same word. Therefore, they're the same person, or they're similar people, or they're related. And it's like, what? What a dumb idea. What a stupid thing to say. It doesn't work. It obviously doesn't work.
They've done two of these now too. They had another one where it was another just generic word that Trump and Pierre shared, where obviously every single person has said it before. I think he just called. No, it was they were calling Stephen Guilbeault crazy, and then they pulled up Donald Trump saying, crazy Bernie, and that's supposed to make us not like Polyev. Also here, like you've said in previous episodes, usually the little hints of wisdom are from Chris here. But the thing, all the liberals are doing by attacking Trump a lot is making people like Trump more. Because the thing is, people actually have very undereducated opinions on Trump. And like that's objectively, people have undereducated opinions on Trump. And that's not because they don't like him, ergo they're undereducated. I mean in the sense that most people just hear Canadian legacy media usually covering Trump's worst moments because it gets a lot of eyes on the screens at the end of their newscasts, and that's what people base their opinion off of. And when the liberals are now saying he's actually a lot like Polyev, well, now you have like 43% of the country saying they're like, oh well, he sounds great then. It's such bad marketing. And you'll notice that the liberals have also stopped attacking Trump because as a Trump climbs up in the swing state polls in the United States, I think they realize that if he wins, they're going to get slaughtered in the next trade negotiations that happen if they won't shut up about how their opposition in Canada is so bad because they're exactly like the guy right over the border who they're going to have to deal with all the time if he becomes the president again.
I see this quite a bit on Twitter these days from liberal surrogates. They're not officially members of the Liberal Party's comms team, but they're commentators and personalities who support the Liberal Party. And they're coming up with this like hilarious line of cope where, oh, when Trump wins, if Trump wins in November, the Liberals are going to gain 5 points in the polls. But then you look at every single poll that poll tests how Canadians think, who Canadians want to deal with Trump. Poilievre overwhelmingly wins. Now, you could argue, based on those polls, that Poilievre overwhelmingly wins because the Conservatives support Poilievre and the Conservatives have the strongest vote. But does that really matter? Why? It doesn't really matter why people support you if people support you.
Yeah, and that's where people get so overcomplicated on. That's why I hate online politics so much. When people get really into ideologies, and that you have to be cool enough to vote for the party, and then we start getting like really crypto and hyper analyzing about why people do what they do, when you just need somebody to get over the finish line and vote for you. And they don't seem to understand that. And every party doesn't. The party that least understands this is the PPC, because they need you to be like hyper emotional to vote for them, because you have to like prove yourself to them that you're cool enough to vote for their party.
Yeah. Give me a second here. I'm going to see if I can find one of these polls just to illustrate the point. I might. Abacus pulls this on a regular basis, but I don't know if it's in their regular releases or a different one. Let's see. I am not seeing it. Well, you'll have to trust me on that one, but generally speaking, Abacus is finding that whatever percentage of the population supports Poilievre to be prime minister also support Poilievre to deal with Trump, which really, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, why would you be shocked by that number? The people who like the Conservative Party and Poilievre also think he's going to be the better leader to handle foreign leaders, because of course they do, because that follows from the first assumption. The idea that people are going to suddenly change their mind on who to vote for because some other politician in some other country has elected is wild. Like, I know Canadians have this hyper...
There's a little bit of stuff that could work on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think after the next presidential election in the U.S., if Trump wins, I could see some knee-jerk reactionary move towards 3% of people now voting Liberal because I'm standing up against the MAGA conservatives. But that will wear off over time, and overall, those were probably voters who were on the fence anyways, who were probably part of the group of people who are going to go back to the Liberals as the next election got closer, because the Conservatives are not going to keep a 21-point lead. It's not because I don't believe in them or I'm like trying to vote against them here, but it's just naturally it's really hard to hold on to that big of a lead in a multi-party parliamentary system unless you're Labour in the UK and you're running against the Conservatives.
But even Labour in the UK is not necessarily holding on to that kind of lead because...
Oh yeah, that's the problem is they're losing a lot of voters themselves to Reform. They actually can't punch over 40% in a lot of polls now.
Yeah, I'm gonna, out of curiosity, here just bring up the current UK polls just to give an example of this. Here we go. Whoop. So, like, you see now, like, yeah, some of these polls are still in the 20 margins, but some of them are down all the way to 11. Now, some people don't like people polling, but that's a whole other topic altogether. But even some of the other ones
polling one that people can have issue with the guy who puts that one on. Which one was the one that put Reform at 24? It was people polling.
Yeah, it was people polling.
So the problem with people taking issue with his poll saying, oh, he's like the guy who runs it as right wing, is that he also predicted the rise of Reform before it had happened in one of his previous polls. And based on your methodology, you might end up reaching the more fired up people who follow the news closer. And sometimes that's bad because that means your poll results probably are out of date in terms of they'll be more correct in 3 weeks. And that might not be great if we're only in the last week of a race. But he was the first one showing that Reform could overtake the Tories when that seemed insane. And then that happened. And I don't see why 24% is unrealistic for Reform when nobody likes the Tories. They were basically voting for them against Labour, and nobody even really liked Labour. They were only voting Labour because they didn't like the Tories.
I mean, if you look in this particular instance, to look at this Whitestone Insight poll, no idea about this company, by the way. I've not really looked into UK poll companies if they're good or not, but they have them Reform at 20%, so it's not even like 24 is an outlier. Margin of error puts that probably within just about margin of error of those two. But anyways, the point being, it's hard to maintain 20-something point leads, barring like a situation like this where one party just completely collapsing. Well, Conservatives are down like something like 20 points from 2019. Like absolute crushing. Yeah, they had 43.6% in 2019, so they're down. This We Think poll is a 22-point drop, and that's a good poll for them. Like, that's terrible. Some of these other polls are even worse.
Maybe this is a good transition point for talking about consultants in politics, because the UK Tories are an amazing example of how if you keep listening to focus groups and consultants, advisors on how you should govern, rather than just doing what your gut instinct tells you that your base wants you to do, you will eventually lose, even if you're considered like the only good party in the system. Because for the longest time, really, if you're in the UK, who are you going to vote for if you're not in like a region where you can vote for like the Democratic Unionist Party or some other regional interest party? You're going to have to vote Conservative. But even that good faith ended up running out over time, because eventually your voters get fatigued on the idea that they don't get listened to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there is kind of like an annoyance thing where I feel like the biggest feeling towards the strongest feeling people have towards the Conservatives in the UK is like frustrated apathy.
Well, because what you see with the Conservatives in the UK, it's like the perfect case study of this, is they didn't want to do anything that would seem controversial or piss off anybody or be too perceived as reactionary or aggressive or authoritarian. So they just let problems that existed just continually get worse because the only solution to those problems would trigger one of those emotions. For example, the people illegally crossing the English Channel to get into the UK. The only way to solve that would trigger a reaction of people who oppose this to be really mad, to like, you're an authoritarian, you're a bigot, whatever, right? So the only option, if you don't have the mettle to deal with that kind of reaction, is to do nothing. And then the problem just keeps getting worse. And that's just a terrible thing to do, because eventually people are like, okay, if you're not going to do anything about the thing we care about, the problem that's happening, why are we voting for you?
Well, and this is also why I hate the argument that some people will make that, well, if you just let them kind of go mild today, eventually we'll get around to gaining the support to doing the things that certain members of our base have been telling us to do for the last few years. Because you get very used to doing nothing, because generally when you wake up in the morning, you're going to do the thing that you did yesterday. You're not going to just wake up and say, today is the day that we go super hardcore and start like stopping all of the migrant boats and deporting people who shouldn't be here and cracking down on all the Islamist pro-Hamas gangs and stuff like that, and all the other sort of vote stealing that goes on in some of these districts in the UK where it's just like independent pro-Hamas candidates are winning. If you're gotten used to not doing anything about it, it stops feeling like a big crisis. If you kind of you gotten into the hot tub, turned up the temperature, and you gotten used to the higher temperature, you're not just going to be like, oh yeah, I realize what this is crisis, because it feels you stop feeling the difference in how bad things are getting when you get so used to ignoring it at milder points in the issue cycle. And that happens all of the time in Canadian politics as well. That's in a certain sense what's happening in Ontario. They just haven't got to the point where the PC voters have turned on Doug Ford yet, simply because the Ontario Liberals and NDP are so incompetent that a lot of those voters are now going PC. But we now see it bearing bad fruit in Manitoba, with the Manitoba PC party somehow losing the riding of Tuxedo in the by-election, the riding that they haven't lost since the riding was created in 1981, and they probably won the riding before that for the previous 50 years too. Heather Stevenson, the leader of the PC party and former premier, was the person who held that seat, and the guy that took over somehow lost. And I believe he was a political consultant that they threw in as the candidate. He was in Israel when he accepted his nomination.
Okay, I looked into that just quickly. The areas that used to be in the riding before its current borders, one of them, the majority of it, voted straight conservative since ages. Like, I think forever. That area's just been conservative forever, as long as Manitoba's existed. And the other part it has been successive withdrawals from what is modern day River Heights, which was liberal in the past for a little bit. But for the most part, this area, the core of this region, has been conservative in in Manitoba forever. And then they just got utterly slapped. And they didn't even do very well in 2023 either. Like, Stephenson's barely won herself.
And again, it wasn't even like this was a riding that was slowly trending NDP over a few elections. It was just last election, and it was this election. Mm-hmm. And it's because the PC party in Manitoba, I can't think about anything strong to say about them. And someone could say, well, you don't follow Manitoba politics very closely. Granted, I don't. Also, I shouldn't have to. If the PC government, before they lost, and the PC party now, if they were doing anything innovative and interesting, I'd probably have heard about it. And I'm not going to pretend like I need to go read their policy book to figure out what all the exciting things they're up to are. That's not my job. If they are doing something exciting, I should hear about it through pure osmosis, because I'm in the political space enough that that stuff would come to me. Like New Brunswick, much smaller province, and Blaine Higgs has a lot of attention on him because he is an inherently controversial politician in a good way. He creates things that people he like his presence on an issue, him saying something makes people want to talk more about himself as a person and what his new plan or initiative is, or the stance he's taking against something. Like even him just banning that really overtly sexual sex ed organization from teaching in schools. Great move, got him a lot of attention. It was the right move to take, and he didn't back down. And he like you even hear what he's doing from the other side of the country, like I am in Alberta. Heather Stevenson and the PC government, I didn't heard a single thing that was interesting about them until they actually jumped on board Blaine Higgs's train in favor of parental rights. And some people try and blame that for their loss, but no, that's why they probably recovered some seats in the 23 election. And or was it early 24 that it was taking place?
The election was 23.
23. But and then someone said like, well, the main issue that lost them that race was the landfill issue with the missing and emerging Indigenous women, where they had canceled effectively the search in this landfill for their bodies. And okay, that probably hurt them. Dumb move. Seems very uncompassionate and silly. At the same time, the only reason that became a top issue is there's nothing else to say about them.
Yeah. Someone I talked to describing it quite well, and the PCs in Manitoba under Stephenson basically ran to the left, like center left, for most of their time in government. And so the campaign came, and they tried to pivot to the center right, and all that did is just nothing. People were like already checked out, because it turns out people who want to vote for a conservative party are not that kind of person. They don't want that kind of flip-flopping. It's kind of like the reverse O'Toole, if you can think about it that way. And that's what everyone I've talked to from Manitoba has basically said. That is their conclusion about Stephenson and the PCs in Manitoba. They don't really know what they're doing. They don't really care what they're doing. They're kind of boring. They're too safe.
And the thing is that usually I find the more boring a politician is, and this is not a general rule that people should walk around with and repeat. So, do not do as I say. But that usually the more boring governments I find are usually the more corrupt ones in terms of the less innovative policies, because they're not just sitting in their offices doing nothing. It's usually a lot of regulatory wrangling to please specific lobby groups and interest groups that they're trying to corral. But the average voter never hears about this stuff because they're like servicing 500 voters at a time, or a singular company sometimes. And they think that that's buying them enough votes, it's cobbling together a big enough coalition. But the problem is most voters are not a part of an interest group, and they do not have interests that align with kind of lobby interests and unions and whatnot. And so the thing is, if they've just detected that you stop caring about them, they'll stop caring about you too, because why wouldn't they? And that's exactly what happened to Kevin Falcon and BC United after they changed their name from the BC Liberals. And frankly, it was happening before they changed the name too. The name change was not the reason that they fell apart. It's just a symptom of how bad things have gotten. And this is why I hate consultants. And even though we're not naming specific people, because these people are all pretty much nameless. Some people know them in the background, but for the most part, because they're unelected individuals on the back end of parties, you don't know who they are. And in British Columbia, United effectively turns into just a consultant party. Like their conventions, despite having the second most seats in the legislature, their conventions were barren, and it was mostly lobbyists and consultants who were showing up to them because they had taken control of the party. And surprisingly, when you're basically being purely run by consultants, they created a party that only a consultant would want to vote for.
There's an interesting problem that happens with public organizations. When I say public, I mean like publicly owned corporations. And this is true with political parties too, is a publicly owned corporation often can get stuck in a trap if they don't have a strong CEO who can stand up to their board, where all they do is cater after the short-term shareholder interests as opposed to the long-term success of the company. So you get a lot of weird, wacky stuff like layoffs just to make their quarterly income statements look better, or recycling like the same video game over and over again, or pumping out movies that suck because they're too safe. You see this kind of stuff happen because the CEO or the people in charge are too weak to stand up to the investors about what's actually in the interest of the company. And political parties fall into the same trap too, where you have the vested money interests who fund the party, which the party needs. You need the people who give you donations. But you have to be able to look at people who give you donations and tell them, look, I don't work for you. You pay me. You pay the party to do things. But I don't work for you. But a lot of people like Kevin Falcon or other leaders in the past will kind of get that dichotomy like wrong in their head, and they think they work for the people who are giving them donations. So they try to be really safe. They don't want to do anything to alienate or offend their donors, when it's actually the completely wrong perspective. The leader of a party, the political party's purpose, who they're serving, is the people in the province or the country. But then you get this kind of dichotomy stuck. And when you're in this dichotomy that Falcon's in, where you're just serving the donors, you just gut the base of your party. No one cares about you anymore.
Well, and they're the type of people who are reacting to brand new, very polished video comes about Ken Falcon. Oh, look, he's really working hard. He's fighting back, and these people will be foolishly giving money. And the funny thing is, their interest is getting united across the finish line with the general ideas that the party represents. And you could have a moderate policy book like the BC Liberals and United had, and still get attention. But the problem is that people, and that's where, again, you need to be controversial sometimes and take some stances. But the donors probably just saw all this content coming out, and that they assume that content equals good. And this is honestly the same thing with the movie industry, is that, especially since streaming came out, simply getting content out the door is considered par for the course good enough. But when people kind of stop liking the slop that you're serving up, they will go somewhere else. And there's no way of, and I think people just associate advertising spending with votes, and that's just not how it works. Mike Bloomberg proved in 2020 that money does not actually buy votes. He spent $1 billion and won American Samoa.
That still cracks me up every time I hear about it.
Yeah, and you have to share it with Tulsi Gabbard.
And so, like, what we have here, right, is these are the polls in BC, and I've covered this previously in other videos, but, like, you look here, before the name change, they're around 30%, give or take, right? Immediately after the name change, they're still around 30%, give or take. Now, the name change itself, as Wyatt points out, it's not itself was the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. And the problem is the leaders of BC United don't understand why they're losing to the BC NDP. They don't understand how Ebby's getting 47% of the vote. They don't understand how they lost to Horgan in 2020. So they're just kind of flailing around. They're like, Trudeau's unpopular. We're called liberals. We should eject that. Do something different. But they don't know what they're doing. They have no theory of politics here. They're just trying to be safe, uncontroversial. The minimal change is necessary to try to win. But that's not how anything works. Because voters don't care about any of that. Voters don't care if you're controversial, as long as you are saying things that they want to happen. If voters really did not want controversial leaders, Danielle Smith would have lost last year. And she won. Quite comfortably. Despite what some people will say and be like, oh, it was down to a few hundred votes and like 8 ridings or whatever. And it's like, okay, but that's not actually how elections work. The NDP, barring some like gargantuan, amazing get out the vote machine, isn't going to only increase their vote share by like 5,000 voters to win the election. They're actually going to be in a position to get that kind of vote split they're probably gaining 100,000 voters to do that. Now the actual reality of an election turns out. It's like, so if something's close, it doesn't mean the election was close. It just means like that percentage margin actually matters more than the individual seat margins, despite what people who don't like first past the post get into. Like it, counting up individual seats, that's how the election works. But you don't just win the election by individual seats. There's more complexity to this than that.
I hate proportional representation so much whenever people like say this is the solution to all of our problems. I'm like, I don't think you realize that there's something very silly about our parliament becoming just a collection of niche pet parties, of parties that only represent like two very narrow issues. Whereas like it's better that you have to make a Big Ten party in Canada as somebody who got disqualified from a nomination. It would be great if Elections Canada actually oversaw nominations the way that, you know, primaries in the US are. You have a right to run if you're a registered Republican or Democrat for that party. People can't arbitrarily kick you out if you meet the requirements to get a certain amount of signatures to get in the race. That's fine. But like that. But the thing is that forces you, the first past the post system and then the primary system in front of it. It forces you to have to appeal to big tent interests rather than just cobbling together. And some ridings, obviously, there's going to be some ridings where certain niche interests still can get you across the finish line. You know, you see that in the UK where just being pro-Hamas can frankly get you over the line. But generally, it's not good for the whole country to break up into, I want this very, when I say fringe, I just mean in terms of not a lot of people care, this fringe issue and this fringe issue. So you'll have tons of tiny parties just pop up. Especially if you just make it that you just need enough of a percentage of the vote to equal one seat. Because even proportional representation, they still have to draw the line somewhere. You need at least 5%. Which, look, why is it you need 5%? That's stupid. Why can't you just only get like 0.3% of the vote to get one seat? Well, you know, you would have too many random small parties. I'm like, yeah, it's almost like that's true. Like, what are you talking about? Like the stipulations that proportional representation requires proves the system doesn't work.
Yeah,
and it creates bubbles.
I'll just bring up a good example of this. So we have the Netherlands here. Look how many parties are like 2, 3, 5 seats.
SGP is a party that since I believe the 20s is a Calvinist rural interest party, and they've only ever won 2 or 3 seats the entire time because they serve a specific demographic. Those people like them, and there is a certain sense there's nothing in the system. Like, and maybe if I was there, I'd vote for that kind of a party. But the problem is there's no incentive in the system to have to work with others. Even coalitions are actually deeply difficult to put together in PR systems because your party is incentivized to be as purist as possible. Very, very infrequently is a party punished for not working with others. If anything, your voters usually punish you for compromising to get things done. That's honestly what happened in Italy that really helped the Brothers of Italy party and Giorgia Meloni rise, is that, one, all the parties basically just backed COVID policies, which made them look bad. But also, they were criticizing them for cooperating with the current government on too many things. And so you actually are incentivized to gridlock and then only vote for the safest of safe social democracy type things in terms of like programs and big spending items that most voters will be in favor of when they don't have to suffer the consequences right away.
And the other thing I'll just point to with the Netherlands example, so like we have this party here, J2221, FVD, PVV, and I think there's been others too, but all these parties were all at one point the same party. And they just keep splintering off because there's enough people to have that just slightly disagree who are like, no, we're going to make our own list and make our own party. So they just keep splintering because all you need to do to win seats is to get apparently 0.68% of the vote. It's pretty small. Like, that's not very difficult if you have any national machinery available. And the other thing I will just say, too, overall, so, to be clear, why it's more anti-PR, I'm just don't care.
I'm more so anti-PR because I'm more so anti the change being made because, frankly, the change doesn't even really matter that much because even in public choice theory, doesn't matter what the system is. Generally, people are still going to get what they want regardless of what the system is, unless it's so janky that it causes stupid coalitions. So, like in systems where you need barely any votes to be able to win a seat, that's when things can get silly. Like in the Netherlands, where it's the JA21 is getting a seat with 0.6% of the vote.
I'll actually bring up a really good case study of this. So, for those of you who are watching this, you're probably well aware that there is a French election happening right now for the legislature because Macron called a snap election following the European parliamentary races. And what are we seeing is we're seeing the National Rally and allies around 36% right now. And they're in a position they might win a majority in the legislature. Now, this is remarkable to some sense because the conventional narrative is the French electoral system was created so that at the time, the National Front, which is now the National Rally, could never win government. And this just proves, this is the perfect case study, you can't make a voting system to force an outcome. If people want National Rally to form government, they will just vote accordingly to do that. Barring a couple elections right after changing the system, where people haven't gotten used to how the voting behavior works, people will just vote accordingly. Most people are smart enough to understand how that works. Or they trust someone who's smart enough to know how that works and just do what they say. You can't make a system to change how elections work. Like who's going to form government. You can change how the votes are counted, you can change how the seats are distributed, but the ideology that forms government is not going to be decided by how you've counted votes on average in the long term.
Yeah, and that's that real theory is just like you can't really short circuit how many people are going to vote for what. Unless it's like literally like the early 1800s in the UK where you have literal pocket boroughs where there's only 300 voters compared to like other districts where it's like 30,000 because it's just they're doing it on geography and this area of very rich people gets to have their own MP and you just put up some random guy to represent like the interests of rich people who had royal land titles. Eventually, if every seat is generally distributed with population in mind or with regional boundaries in mind, you're going to get something that generally looks like what the public wants, unless you get absurd elections like in the UK right now, where the opposition to the Labour is so split up that it's hard for them to get a lot of seats. But at the same time, Labour would have probably still won a majority regardless, or they would have been able to easily cobble together some sort of majority government in PR, because when you look at them, they're at like 40%, 38%, and, you know, Lib Dem is at 11 or 12, and you have Greens at 6 or 7. It's like it's very easy for them to put something together based on pretty much any of these polls.
Yeah, if we just take like I don't know this Redfield and Wilton poll here, center my screen, just Lib Dem and Labour in a PR system would form a majority government.
And people could say, well, but it's wrong because they're winning a majority with only a big majority with only 42% of the vote. Okay, do you want to do like an elimination vote, like a ranked ballot? Do you think that Lib Dem, SNP, and Green are not going to compile into Labour anyways?
And the other thing,
just more steps.
The other thing that's worth noting with that too is I think a lot of this boils down to people. For some, I see this argument pop up where it's like, well, the 42% of the vote, they're getting 100% of the power, and it's like, okay, but if they have 50.1% of the vote in PR, they also get 100% of the power. Like. Just having, like, you could say, oh, the Conservatives will have 18% of the seats and Reform will have 19% of the seats, so they have 19% of the power. No, they won't. If they're not in government, they have 0% of the power. Effectively. Like, the amount of power you have in committee and in legislature when you do not have a majority is almost zero. You don't really do anything because the way government works is binary. Either you form government and are running the executive branch, or you don't.
And to a certain extent, you also just need somebody to be running the government, where some people get really picky, like, well, these people have 20% of the vote, so they should be running the government 20% of the time in like a certain terms of power. It's like, actually no, the better thing is to just have one group coherently doing what they want to do, which might be against the interests of other people, but that's better than like everything always just being a muddled mess where every government would just turn into like the worst version of like a centrist party where, other than being able to agree on spending more, that's all they can do.
Well, Italy, as you mentioned earlier, would have been a really interesting case study if the Brothers of Italy party didn't exist, where every party went together in that national unity government. And then if the Brothers of Italy party wasn't there, what would have happened? And it probably would have been returning almost the exact same government. But then you introduce the seed of a party that disagreed with everybody, and then suddenly the Brothers of Italy party went from 4% to like 30%, and now Maloney is exceptionally popular as prime minister. And that happens because power sharing, if everyone is power sharing, nothing will change ever politically, because there's no difference to voters. Voters can't parse what happened. No one knows who's responsible for what. Who did the bad thing? Who did the good thing? You don't know. You can't know because you're all in power.
It takes a maverick personality to make a lesser minority seat in a coalition really amount to more than the popular vote or percentage of seats demonstrates. So like a Jack Layton was actually really good at being a non-government opposition and it was, we almost had a coalition government in 2008 and 11. But he was good at getting some extractions from the government by being aggressive. But really, Jagmeet Singh, it's not because Jagmeet Singh's pathetic that he kind of goes along with whatever Justin Trudeau and the Liberals want. That's just what most minority government type coalitions are like. Because one party has a lot of leverage because they have all the money to run another election. And even though Jagmeet Singh could be playing hardball and maybe should be playing hardball, the average individual running a party is not going to have the guts to force the hand of a larger party on any issue when they know that if they look like they're the ones who collapse the government, their vote might fall apart if they don't know how to play it right. And most people don't know how to play it right. So what we're seeing in Canada is not the exceptional weakness of Jagmeet Singh. We're probably seeing the average weakness of an average political leader.
We have the UK up here, and the UK is a good example of this, where the Lib Dems coalition with the Conservatives in 2010, and they got absolutely crushed by that. For every single reason, the NDP has been taking a lot of hits working with Liberal minority governments. And it's not because the Lib Dems or the NDP are necessarily doing a bad job, per se. It's that if you are the minority party propping up a majority government, you get all the blame and none of the credit. That's how it works. Because you're the one, you are actually responsible for everything bad and good that happens. Sorry, again, for all the things that... Sorry, I phrased that wrong. Yeah. You are responsible for all the bad things that happen, but you're responsible for none of the good things that happen, because the good things could not happen without the larger party, but the bad things could only happen because you allowed it.
And the thing is that we also have but just going back a little bit, like Jack Layton was able to make it work because he actually knew how to put in the work to make as a minority partner, to always be almost berating and badgering your partner. If you enter into a good faith coalition, you'll do badly. If you go into it like Jack Layton was, who's strategically only making deals to say the other people broke the deal first, that's how you basically do it. Effectively, it's a game of who can say the other person broke the deal first in terms of who's going to benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so often I find a lot of the pushes that you see people do to change electoral systems, ignoring like the idea that I think a lot of it is really just they don't like how the election, like their party loses elections and they want to win elections, or they want to get seats in parliament, which I think is definitely a motivation. But even ignoring that motivation, which definitely exists, I think there's just this desire a lot of people have to fix society, to just make everything perfect and work. Like, there's a utopian world where you can make elections just perfectly, flawlessly work, and nothing will ever be wrong, and we'll always be happy. But the cruel truth of that, we know through mathematical proof, which is quite interesting, you should look that up at some point if you're interested in this, but we know mathematically speaking, you cannot have an election system that's perfect. It's truly impossible. It cannot happen. Because glossing over things that you want your voting system to do, you cannot satisfy all simultaneously. It's not possible. So you have to make a compromise. You're sacrificing one thing or another. Actually, it's old now, so they're not as good videos as some of the newer ones coming out. But I have a series on electoral systems. You can take a look at that if you want more in-depth detail of that, like the first video especially. But the long story short is you can't have all these things. You can't have a perfect electoral system. You can't have a perfect government system. All you can have is good enough. And I think a lot of people don't like that good enough is all we can do.
Oh, that's probably a good way of ending off here, considering considering you ended off saying that that's the best we can do.
Yeah. Not bad. So, if you guys like this video, by all means, go in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, comment all your things. I will just let everyone know, if you've watched this part in the video, congratulations, you are a hardcore watcher of the channel. I will be going on hiatus through most of July, because obviously I'm getting, you might not be obvious, but for those of you who are aware, I am getting married, so I'm not going to work while I'm before, during, and after my wedding. So I'll see you at the my last video. My last video will be July 1st, and then it'll be July 29th before we start publishing again.
Incredible! Your honeymoon isn't just you filming podcasts with me.
Oh, yeah, I know. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Well, I bet everyone.
Well, maybe when we return, we can talk about nomination politics, and I can give up more details about the crazy nomination that I appeared in, which was actually probably going to be the most active and crazy nomination this entire cycle.
Yeah, something to look forward to. But with that, we bid you adieu.